Welcome to Part 6 of Herbert Has Been Murdered. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 26. 25 RM. There was a sailor. Mrs. Quammen hadn't gone to bed at all. She stood there like a striking silhouette, solid and dark, while he had once found himself pressed against the panels of her bedroom door, straining to catch a hint of what lay within. Lieutenant Williams was keenly aware of her demeanor regarding Franklin's body. The moment she stepped into the room, her gaze had darted directly to it, sharp and unwavering. There was no sadness, no horror or fear of death in that look. It reflected pure triumph, a sense of satisfaction born from revenge that transcended petty grievances. In that gaze lay the burning satisfaction of avenging something dark and wicked, the torment of Franklin's very black and wicked soul. After that initial moment, she averted her eyes from the bed and chose to sit with an extraordinary stiffness on the edge of a chair, directing her stare toward the window, where the crisp morning light of a winter day streamed in. "Several hours ago, Mrs. Quammen," Lieutenant Williams said abruptly, "you expressed considerable bitterness about Mr. Franklin's treatment of the servants. I won't embarrass you by asking for details, but there are a couple of things I need to know. Are you listening to me?" She pulled her attention from the sunlight, from the pale, misty air where she had been collecting her thoughts, nourished by a long-held seed of hatred. "I'm listening," she replied. "Then the first thing I need to know is this. Was there any particular incident where Mr. Franklin's behavior toward one of the servants was especially cruel or met with resentment?" The embers began to glow faintly beneath the ashes in her eyes. "Yes, there was one very specific incident, Lieutenant. Recently, Mrs. Quammen. It happened about a year ago, nearly to the day." "Did Mr. Franklin assault her?" "Yes." "Here in the house?" "No, Lieutenant. It took place on her day off. Mr. Franklin's car was parked out front on the street. He offered her a ride." "Where is this girl now, Mrs. Quammen?" "She was committed last year to a mental institution." The ash had vanished completely, and her eyes burned with a fierce determination. "But surely she filed any charges, Mrs. Quammen?" "She was in a fragile state when they found her, Lieutenant. She tried to throw herself in front of a car in Central Park. She hasn't spoken coherently since." Lieutenant Williams sighed in frustration. There it was again, that dreadful wave of gossip surfacing amidst the calm waters of solid truth. Rumors suggested that Nancy Norwich had killed her husband. Now they were hinting at all sorts of terrible implications involving Franklin, who was dead, and a girl locked away in an asylum, and neither of them could provide testimony to clarify or contest the claims. "What was Mr. Franklin's explanation?" he asked. "He said he drove her to Macy's, where she wanted to shop, and left her there." And why not? It was clear that Franklin had serious flaws, but without a multitude of illuminating details, including the entire medical history of the girl's family, the case held little weight. "Did you know this girl well, Mrs. Quammen?" "Yes, I make it a point to know all of the girls in my care very well. I believe it's my responsibility to serve not just as a housekeeper, but also as their spiritual mentor and guide." Then, in this girl's case, had she ever shown signs of mental instability before? "There were moments when I suspected so, yes. Her family, as you might imagine, had its troubles. On her mother's side, her grandmother had been mentally ill. That's what made Mr. Franklin's behavior so shockingly despicable, sir. She could have led a normal, productive, happy life if he hadn't harmed her so profoundly." Yet, Lieutenant Williams thought, it was also possible that Franklin hadn't done anything remotely as sinister as the rumors suggested. With the strain of madness so deeply rooted in her blood, it's likely that no external force was necessary to trigger it. And then, he reminded himself, the girl had been out shopping. He often found himself wondering why more women didn't lose their minds while shopping. Did Mr. Franklin have any alibi for the time between when he left her at Macy's and when he got back home? No, Lieutenant. He said he had driven a ways out on Long Island along the motor parkway and then returned. So nothing was done about this officially. There was nothing to pursue. Then the only fact that checks out is that someone saw her getting into Mr. Franklin's car in front of this house. I take it someone did. Yes. Who? Mrs. Franklin saw her, Lieutenant. That was certainly worth considering. No matter how scattered the leads in the case seemed, they all circled around the significant presence of Mrs. Franklin. Is this girl still at the institution, Mrs. Quammen? I'm not sure. There's been no word, no communication. What was the color of her hair, Mrs. Quammen? Black, the deepest, most beautiful black I've ever seen. They say opposites attract, and that was true in her case. What do you mean by that? Her husband was a blonde. Lieutenant Williams inhaled sharply. It fit together surprisingly well. The motive, the crime, the possibility that the girl had kept her key to the servant's entrance for her husband to find. And he would have been quick to believe the rumors about his wife and Franklin. Husbands often did that. In his mind, it wouldn't have been something as trivial as an eccentric grandmother driving his wife to madness. It would have been Franklin. Madame Suarez's hints about the true identity of anyone returned to Lieutenant Williams with frustrating clarity. What about Hollander? Hollander was a blonde, clearly of a different standing in education and social status than the Franklins. And who had pointed out Hollander? No one. Franklin and his wife were the only ones in the house who could, and now Franklin was dead. Mrs. Franklin claimed she hadn't seen Hollander at all, professing it was true that she had never stepped out onto the balcony or made her way to the window from which the shot had been fired. What if the man who had sat with Franklin was merely pretending to be Hollander? What if he was actually the husband of that unfortunate girl? Perhaps he had been lurking outside, waiting for a chance to slip back into the house. He could have ambushed Hollander, taken his driver's license and cards, and used them to convince O'Brien at the door to let him in. Yet, that fundamental question lingered. What had the attacker hoped to find among Franklin's papers? Surely this girl's husband wouldn't be searching for anything unless it was damning proof of his wife's betrayal, and that idea seemed rather flimsy. What happened to this girl's husband, Mrs. Quammen? He's a sailor on merchant ships. She waved her hand broadly, as if to signal the vast expanse of the oceans. Where he is, or when he'll be back, is as unpredictable as the wind and the tide. Lieutenant Williams didn't challenge her exaggeration. He chose not to mention that, nowadays, the tides and winds could be predicted with remarkable accuracy. He stood up. Thank you, Mrs. Quammen. Should I leave? If you would be so kind. Perhaps later we can discuss the details about this poor girl's husband more thoroughly. Mrs. Quammen allowed herself one last, piercing look at the bed. She paused at the door and declared, "You will never hear his name from me, Lieutenant. I'm the only one who knows. I'm the only one who knows she was even married. She confided in me, and if it was her husband who did this, you will never pry his name from my lips, even if my silence means." Her expression clouded, her thoughts becoming muddled. She wanted to say something magnificent, something truly fitting for the occasion, which she believed with all her heart was a divine act orchestrated by God, with poor, fragile little Maisie's husband as his instrument here on earth. But no words came to her. Her silence lingered, heavy and overwhelming. Thoughts raced through her tired mind, but they felt disjointed and meaningless, a bar of justice, herself standing in judgment. It was just so cruel. Life was cruel, and living was even harsher. Only death offered kindness, a reprieve with the sweet peace under his divine grace. She stumbled slightly as she crossed the threshold, tears flowing as she made her way back upstairs, sobbing without purpose. Chapter 27. 46 a.m. Mrs. Franklin is missing. Lieutenant Williams crossed the hallway and knocked on Mrs. Franklin's door. There was no answer. He knocked again, and still nothing. He turned the knob, and the door swung open. The room was empty. He closed the door and called for Christian, who was standing at the end of the corridor. "Sir," Christian replied as he approached. "You've been out here the whole time, haven't you, Christian?" "Only except when I went upstairs to fetch the housekeeper, sir." "That's right. Come in here for a moment. I need to ask you a few questions." They entered Franklin's room. "It's nice to see daylight again, Lieutenant. Will we wrap things up here soon?" "I have a feeling we'll be done shortly. Tell me, Christian, was it you or Hansen who fired first at Hollander?" "Lieutenant, Hansen and I have been arguing about that very issue. We nearly came to blows over it." "Why that?" "Because I swear he fired the first shot, and he has the nerve to claim it was me who both shot first and fired twice before he even pulled the trigger." "Exactly what I wanted to find out. You were both right and wrong." "How can that be, Lieutenant?" "Neither of you fired the first shot. It came from the murderer over by the window. You heard it and thought Hansen shot first. Hansen heard it too, then heard your shot and thought you fired twice." "That makes sense now, Lieutenant." "It does. The second thing I need to ask you about is Mrs. Franklin. She's not in her room. Have you seen her around the corridor or anywhere else?" "No, sir." "Then go find her. Ask the men downstairs if they've seen her, and if they haven't, check the rooms on this floor and the one above. When you find her, could you ask her to come in here and see me?" "Yes, Lieutenant." Christian stepped out and closed the door behind him. Lieutenant Williams was starting to feel incredibly weary. He let out a big yawn, gazed out the window for a minute or two, and then settled back down at his desk. There was something he needed to do before he was interrupted by Madame Suarez's arrival. What was it? It wasn't related to that nagging sense of danger that was creeping in on him with growing urgency, but it was just as elusive. As faint as a shadow. Yes, that was it, the thing he had forgotten. He wanted to trace the faint scent that oddly reminded him of a place, something he couldn't quite place. It had come from the opening where he had retrieved the drawer. He reached inside and felt around. Tucked deep in the back was a crumpled letter made of heavy notepaper. He pulled it out, and the scent grew stronger. It came back to him clearly now. It was the same perfume that had soaked the note Nancy left for Madame Suarez at the apartment. He took the letter from its envelope, smoothed it out, and then turned it over to see the signature. Yes, it was signed Nancy. A knock at the hall door broke his concentration, and he set the letter down on the desk. Hansen walked in. "Yes, Hansen." "I searched all the yards you instructed, sir." "Well?" "I didn't find any gun, Lieutenant, not that I could see." "Did you check all the bushes? There are some evergreens down there that I noticed." "Yes, sir. I looked both through and under every one of them." "All right, Hansen." Lieutenant Williams studied the young man standing before him for a moment. "You were at sea for a while, weren't you?" "Yes, sir. I served in the Navy during the war, and afterward spent a year or two on merchant ships." "Is it possible for a sailor to climb up to the balcony, outside this window from the garden?" "I can't say for sure, Lieutenant. I didn't pay much attention to the balcony while I was down there." "Then go take another look, and let me know if it would be an easy task, a difficult one, or impossible." "Yes, sir." Hansen left, and Lieutenant Williams had barely resumed his focus on the letter from Nancy Norwich when there was another knock at the door. This time, it was Christian who entered. Lieutenant Williams put the letter back on his desk and turned to him. "Did you find Mrs. Franklin, Christian?" "No, sir, I didn't." Lieutenant Williams felt a peculiar unease. He had half expected Christian to reply that way. The denial only confirmed his nagging sense of some unseen threat. "Did you check all the rooms?" "Yes, sir." "Did you ask anyone?" "Everyone, Lieutenant. No one has seen her." "What about the men at the doors?" "Each one was at his post, sir. She didn't go out." "In that case," Lieutenant Williams said, "she must still be inside." The thought was both a comfort and a relief. After all, he reassured himself, people didn't just disappear. It simply didn't happen anymore. As he contemplated the possible whereabouts of the elusive Mrs. Franklin, his hands mechanically organized the piles of letters he had sorted, placing them back into the empty drawer. He carefully set aside Nancy Norwich's letter for later reading, after he figured out a logical explanation for Mrs. Franklin's sudden absence. "He must have been quite the dashing fellow, Lieutenant," Christian remarked, glancing curiously at a stack of pink envelopes that was slipping out of sight. "Indeed he was, Christian. Where could she be hiding? And why should she? Each one of them is from some woman." "That's right, Christian, every single one." It was clear she was desperate to leave the house and visit Hollander at the hospital, but how could she have gotten past the men guarding the doors? She couldn't. "It really is unbelievable what some guys can pull off, Lieutenant." "But it's never really unbelievable, Christian." Hanson had even checked the backyards, considering she might have attempted the absurd feat of scaling fences. That seemed impossible. "It's not all about looks, you know, or money, either." Christian cast a glance at the bed, which was only half a compliment. "I've hung out with guys who were just shy of being complete animals, but they knew how to attract attention. Am I right, Lieutenant?" "Absolutely, Christian." The roof was steep and offered no way onto the neighboring houses. You could hardly imagine her clambering over rooftops any more than believing she would leap over fences. And the worst part about these girls who do have it, they're never satisfied. No one is ever satisfied, Christian. There might still be a way to the roof from the attic. Not ever with anything, Lieutenant. Not really, no. He thought of the attic and that peculiar look that he had interpreted as some form of exaltation. It seemed unlikely, but still. "Stay right here, Christian." Christian jumped, startled. The words were like sparks from flint against steel. The lieutenant's sudden rush toward the door was unexpected. A possible explanation for Mrs. Franklin's absence had just struck him with horrifying clarity. Chapter 28. 6:00 a.m. Mist drifting through mist. Lieutenant Williams dashed out the door and hurried along the corridor, racing up the stairs to the next floor. He knew the entrance to the stairs leading to the attic had to be nearby. He had to be quiet, careful not to disturb or shock. Thank goodness the treads were solid and didn't creak. There was a window in the attic, located at the garden end of the peak, not large, but enough to let in the pale morning light that cast a grey hue over the room. Mrs. Franklin had her back to him, facing the window, and the soft light blurred around her dark silhouette. She stood atop an upturned trunk, her hands reaching up to a rafter where she had tied one end of a short rope. The other end formed a noose around her neck. Lieutenant Williams gauged the distance from where he stood at the top of the stairs to the trunk. He realized he could never reach it without making a sound. Yet if he shouted or spoke, or even chose the wrong word, anything that startled her would shatter the calm resignation she held. He pulled a penknife from his pocket, slid it along the laces of his shoes, and removed them quietly. Thank goodness her back was to him, and the window bathed the room in a soft grey light that seemed to provide her with some private moment of farewell to the world, the last ritual every tormented soul engages in before trading their conscious solitude for the uncertain company of the damned. He was so close to her now, moving like a whisper through the mist. He could hear her soft murmurs, a thin stream of meaning rather than clear words, flowing from the greyness towards that distant light, sent through a small window into the immeasurable brilliance of eternity. Her hands rested comfortably by her side, her body gradually relaxing into stillness. "And if you're there, Tom, darling, and Herbert, too." He could step forward now and catch her if necessary, yet it was wiser to remain back, absolutely secure. "It won't be heaven, dear. There's no place for the likes of you and me in heaven, but when you come." His arms wrapped gently around her, and her body stiffened like steel. She relaxed immediately, then looked down at him with indifference. She removed the noose from around her neck as casually as if she were taking off a hat. He lifted her down to the floor. "There's no rush," she said. He understood she was hinting at a future where he and the law would no longer concern her, and she could again plan her eternal journey without supervision or restraint. No rush, Mrs. Franklin, nor any need now. The word now pulled her sharply from her thoughts. She looked at him with intense curiosity. Mr. Hollander, he stated, will undoubtedly recover. Yes. The word came out cold, as though from a reserve of icy composure. Doesn't that change things, Mrs. Franklin? Change your intentions? Why should it, Lieutenant? I regret that you choose to remain evasive. I'm not. It's you who misinterpret things, reading meanings in people that simply aren't there. That isn't true, Mrs. Franklin. What else would you like to know? There was no softness, no yielding, and the firmness in her voice was unmistakable. She looked almost remarkably composed in the stylish dark dress she wore. Lieutenant Williams noted how she was one of those rare women who always managed to look their best, regardless of the time or circumstances, who made it a point to present themselves well even when alone, and especially, he thought, when contemplating suicide. But he was not fooled by her facade of strength. Invisible forces churned within her, still unsettled by the emotional climb she must have recently undertaken to decide to end her own life. If he were ever going to understand this intricate woman, he felt he had to do so now, while they stood in their private world, a small sphere of shadows dappled with beams of sunlight filtering through dust, and before they descended the attic stairs into the familiar routine of daily life. He resolved to lead her down certain straightforward paths that might prove treacherous. Why did you have Nancy Norwich's address in your directory, Mrs. Franklin? She replied with the practiced patience of an elder, explaining a complex problem to a child. It was essential to consider her. As I mentioned before, she had a certain status, enough to set her apart from the other women my husband casually involved himself with, and there might come a time when I would need to eliminate her. Not murder. You're too sharp to misunderstand. I mean there are various ways for one woman to remove another from her life that are just as effective. And which method did you use, Mrs. Franklin? It wasn't particularly pleasant, but then I wasn't dealing with a pleasant woman. I resorted to forgery. Lieutenant Williams was caught off guard by this. Forgery? Yes, I added a postscript to a letter Harry Norwich sent me before he married Nancy. Harry never dated his letters. This one was harmless enough, but it included a mention of the camp he owned by the lake up in Maine. The postscript I added completely changed the tone of the letter. It made it clear that Harry was genuinely afraid Nancy was plotting to kill him. I handed that letter to Herbert about a month ago, when it became apparent that his interest in Nancy was growing dangerously serious. Didn't he ask you why you hadn't shown it to him sooner? Yes. I explained that I just stumbled upon it in an old letter file that hadn't been touched in years. I asked him if it was too late to do anything, like showing the letter to the appropriate authorities. Of course, I anticipated his response. That it was too late. Yes. But didn't he also ask why you hadn't mentioned the letter at the time of Harry Norwich's death? I reminded him that we were in Europe then and didn't hear the news until many months later, after we returned. By then, the letter had slipped my mind. And did your action change how your husband felt about Nancy Norwich? It was starting to. Matters like that unfold slowly. They linger in the mind until they finally have an impact. He noted that she had missed her time. If the Medicis had been flourishing, she, too, would have thrived. Mrs. Franklin, what was your true reason for calling the police last night? I can explain that more clearly by detailing my movements from the moment Herbert knocked on the door to say goodbye until you arrived. Will that suffice? I hope so, Mrs. Franklin. I won't deceive you, Lieutenant. I'll tell you exactly what happened. Smithers was in the room with me, adjusting my dress. I left shortly after and headed down the corridor to the sitting room. Mrs. Quammen, my housekeeper, I'm not sure if you've met her. Yes, Mrs. Franklin. She was at the bottom of the stairs leading to the upper floor. She said she had something to tell me, so we went into the sitting room. That was just after 7 o'clock. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Yes. Mrs. Quammen started talking about a particularly awful situation my husband had been involved in with one of our maids over a year ago. Should I go into the details? It's not necessary, Mrs. Franklin. The maid was married. Her husband was a sailor. Franklin paused, taking a moment to gather her thoughts, weighing which pieces of information she wanted to share, and which, despite her recent commitment to honesty, she preferred to keep to herself. You've probably noticed, Lieutenant, that Mrs. Quammen is quite an unusual woman. She embodies the most extreme example of a religious fanatic I have ever encountered. Her life is fundamentally grounded in a blend of faith and duty that she insists all humanity owes to God. She firmly believes in divine retribution for those who sin on earth. Just last night, in my sitting room, she told me that God intended to punish my husband, and that the instrument of that punishment would be the husband of the maid whom Herbert harmed. But if she so clearly wanted this to happen, Mrs. Franklin, why would she warn you, or anyone, about it beforehand? Religious fanatics, Lieutenant, reject the notion that human actions can interfere with any divine plan. Everything, to them, is preordained and is meant to occur exactly as it has been set. But why did she feel the need to warn you? She claimed she wanted to prepare me for the shock. She has always shown extreme sympathy for me regarding what she calls Herbert's sinful actions. Naturally, I pressed her for more details, and eventually she admitted that she had seen, or at least believed she had seen, the maid's husband hanging around the street in front of the house that afternoon. After that, she went upstairs to her own quarters. It seemed ridiculous. Then it started to weigh on your mind. Indirectly. How so? In connection with something else. Lieutenant Williams' intuition kicked in. You're now questioning whether you should tell me everything about the tea, aren't you? How did you make that connection? Between your tea with Mr. Hollander yesterday afternoon and Mrs. Quammen's warning. Yes. It's quite straightforward, isn't it? Is it? Yes, Mrs. Franklin, I believe it is. You can't deny, can you, that you clearly conveyed to Mr. Hollander your serious intention to end it all, whether through suicide or by harming your husband. Mr. Hollander was your trusted confidant for your hidden turmoil, a sort of sounding board for your feelings. I've already confirmed this theory through both Mr. Hollander and his friend. No, I can't deny that. And you believed he would take action to prevent you from following through with your intentions. I suppose I did. In your naturally distressed state last night, Mrs. Quammen's strange prophecy about the maid's husband seeking revenge made a deeper impact on you than you want to admit. You were subconsciously worried that something terrible might happen, that the sailor could actually hurt or kill your husband, and that Mr. Hollander, when the police got involved, would somehow be dragged into it. There was even a chance that, given his devotion to you, he might, upon hearing about your husband's murder, offer a false confession to protect you. It's been done before, you know. You're right, Lieutenant. That's exactly what I thought. The chaos of it all began to drive me to distraction during dinner. I went down at 7:30 and didn't eat anything. I barely managed to stay at the table for more than 5 minutes. I went upstairs to Herbert's room, looking for something, though I can't say what exactly, perhaps some tangible proof of his existence through the things he owned. That's when I noticed the note on his desk. By then I had lost all my resolve, and the note genuinely unsettled me. It was such a direct confirmation of Mrs. Quammen's story. I wasn't exactly panicking, but it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. I tried to call Mr. Hollander, but he wasn't home. I started imagining a convergence of forces, himself, the maid's husband, and Herbert as the center of it all. I felt I had to take action. I called the police. Why didn't you mention the maid and her husband when I arrived, Mrs. Franklin? It's not something one just jumps into right away. You would have told me eventually, then. Of course. And why? He asked quietly. Did you try to steer my suspicions toward Nancy Norwich when, given your unique knowledge, that maid's husband seemed like the obvious suspect. Doesn't that seem a bit inconsistent? She looked at him steadily. Do you always do the right thing at the right time, Lieutenant? Rarely, Mrs. Franklin. Neither do I. I don't think anyone does. She fell back into that patient, explanatory tone of a teacher. A person's actions or words during moments of intense stress are shaped by the situation rather than being a rational reflection of logical factors. In those times, one clings to whatever they can find. Nancy Norwich was just a lifeline. Mrs. Franklin shrugged. Herbert had gone, as I assumed, to see her. I thought whatever happened to him would take place between here and her apartment or during the evening while they were together. I'm not saying my beliefs made sense. I certainly wasn't thinking clearly at that moment. And you would have been perfectly fine, having Nancy Norwich take the blame for anything that happened rather than either the sailor or Mr. Hollander. Oh, absolutely. Her willingness was quite persuasive. As for her credibility, Lieutenant Williams remained uncertain. He shifted to another line of questioning. Why have you kept Smithers around for so long, Mrs. Franklin, when you must know how much she despises you? Mrs. Franklin smiled with genuine amusement. You've never had a maid, have you, Lieutenant? Not really. Then you can't fully understand what I mean when I say that Smithers is a good maid. What does it matter if she hates me? I'm paying for her services, not her feelings, and her work is excellent. I often wish that someone in my ongoing parade of cooks would develop the same kind of commitment. There's something incredibly binding about it. He sensed that she was slipping away from him again, that her defenses were being quickly reinforced. In the brightening light, her face became clearer. She didn't seem quite as mysterious after all. He mused that nothing was truly a riddle in the daylight. It was just a weary face, tired from all sorts of things unrelated to a lack of sleep. I wish you would trust me, Mrs. Franklin, he said. I'm not a bad person, really. I'm not trying to trap you into admitting anything that could harm you. There are still confusions that need to be sorted out. Mr. Hollander has assured me that you were devoted to your husband. You imply that your feelings for Mr. Hollander are strictly platonic, yet you address him in your letters as Tom, darling. And there's no denying that he adores you. This situation isn't a simple love triangle. It's more like a hub with several broken and uneven spokes radiating out. Broken spokes. The phrase struck her in a tragic way that seemed oddly out of place with its cliché quality. But then, he had mentioned it to her before, long ago. Sometimes the simplest things held the most truth, and that's exactly what Tom, Herbert, and she were. And the hub, perhaps it was passion, or maybe some complex mix of love's many forms. It's difficult to simplify human emotions into ABCs, she said. I can't just say I loved Herbert because we were married, and he was the first person I ever loved, or that no matter how many others come into my life, I will always hold a place for him in my heart simply because he was my first love, and expect you to really grasp that. She struggled to articulate her feelings, pushing through the fog of complexity. I love Tom Hollander just as much as I loved Herbert. It isn't pretty, but it's the truth. Love isn't just one thing. It's not a single emotion neatly contained in a single word. It's a myriad of feelings, desires, and all sorts of little aches that yearn to be healed. A hint of bitterness seeped into her tone, a bitterness born from rebellion. The whole lamentable affair is far too contrived. It's perfectly acceptable to love both your father and mother equally. In fact, it's considered wrong if you don't. A precise 50% of your parental love is expected to go to each. Brotherly love also has to be split into equal shares. The love for one's neighbors is presumably distributed endlessly. But if a woman were to claim that this otherwise divisible affection is spent on more than one man... Her laugh was anything but pleasant. Lieutenant Williams felt unsettled. There was something unnervingly rational in her perspective. Was it mere cleverness? Not exactly. There was a significant thread of truth woven throughout her words. It felt pointless to parade around the typical arguments about what widespread acceptance of her implied philosophy would mean for society. He could precisely envision how she would respond to them. Like many who had achieved what they sought, He was utterly confused about what to do next. He couldn't quite ask her if she intended to marry Hollander, and aside from the insight into her character, he wasn't any closer to figuring out who had killed her husband or their motive. Lieutenant Williams began to feel that it was he who was mired in quicksand, not her. "You have been remarkably patient and kind with me, Mrs. Franklin. I'm starting to see where you're coming from. We've come back to that obstacle again, and perhaps this time we can approach it with more certainty. Before we dive in, could you think of any reason why your husband would have joined you in the attic when he found you here yesterday afternoon?" Franklin was still too lost in his thoughts to pay much attention to the specific details at hand. "Well," she said, "it wasn't for the purpose of ending his life. That leaves your other 9/10, doesn't it?" "You mean he must have been looking for something?" "That's the most likely explanation. But does he keep things up here?" "He might. This is his trunk." She wandered toward the window, showing little interest in whatever he might do next. A heavy sense of fatigue enveloped her, and she basked in the sunlight streaming through the dusty panes. Lieutenant Williams righted the fallen trunk and lifted its lid. A few papers were scattered in the top compartment. He examined them closely until he found one certain document that made him gasp. He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. Then he closed the trunk. As he turned to face Mrs. Franklin, his expression was unyieldingly serious. "I need you to tell me," he said, "exactly where you've hidden Nancy Norwich in this house." Chapter 29. 6:30 a.m., as is mirage. Mrs. Franklin fixed Lieutenant Williams with a piercing gaze. A sudden wave of alertness coursed through her. "I think," she said, "you've lost your mind. Do you still insist you saw no one on the balcony when you were at your window, looking toward your husband's room?" "I have no reason to change the truth. I will remain as patient with you, Mrs. Franklin, as you have been with me. Please listen closely, and I will explain why I believe Nancy Norwich killed your husband, and why I suspect you've hidden her somewhere in this house after the crime." "I must listen, Lieutenant, but you are mistaken, completely mistaken. Let's start with the idea that Nancy murdered Harry Norwich during that canoe incident on the lake. I know she's been paying blackmail to her stepmother, Madame Suarez, for some time, probably since the crime itself. A woman like her doesn't pay for silence without being sure the blackmailer has something on her. That made things easy for your husband. Herbert, are you suggesting the outrageous idea that Herbert was blackmailing her? People can be coerced into giving up more than just money, Mrs. Franklin. I'm not saying your husband was after cash. Rather, I believe he held the forged postscript you crafted over Nancy Norwich's head as a threat to achieve some misguided goal. I just found that letter in his trunk, and it's now in my pocket." "Misguided goal, please hold on a moment. I'm trying to understand." "I'm hinting at a sort of cruelty, something particularly cruel." "Perhaps. Herbert liked to see others in pain. He had a subconscious sadism. He likely pushed her to her limits, causing her to decide she needed that letter. He must have greatly inflated its significance as evidence to her, regardless of the risks to herself. I really don't believe that when she came here last night, she had any intention of actually killing your husband. What she wanted was that letter. Did you let her into the house, Mrs. Franklin?" Mrs. Franklin smiled somewhat bitterly and pressed her lips together tightly. "Because if you didn't," Lieutenant Williams continued, "then she must have taken a key from your husband. Either way, she was in the house and searching for the letter in Mr. Franklin's room sometime around 7 last night. Mr. Franklin was supposed to be miles away at her apartment according to their appointment, leaving her free and clear. She had clearly thought this through, as she left a note for Madame Suarez, who was expected for a visit that evening. Nancy suggested in the note that it was written after 7, but the truth is it likely was written much earlier and planted in the apartment either as an alibi or to explain to Mr. Franklin why she wasn't there. It would have certainly prompted him to rush to the Colonial looking for her. That plan didn't work out, of course, as he was held up by the argument he had with you and ended up here instead of at her apartment, as she believed he would be. Don't you see how it all fits together?" Indeed, but I still don't understand what connection this has to me. It has everything to do with you, Mrs. Franklin. Unless we can prove that Nancy Norwich fired the shot this morning that killed your husband, we'll unfortunately have to consider laying the charge against you. I may be quite dull, Lieutenant, but I don't see why I would have shot my husband around 2 or 3 this morning just because Nancy Norwich was looking for a letter in his room at 7 last night. Please think of this as 2 separate crimes, and follow that line of reasoning. At 7 o'clock last night, we found Nancy Norwich rummaging through your husband's clothes in his closet. He enters the room, and she finds herself cornered inside. When he opens the door, the shock of seeing her sends him into a panic. She thinks he's dead and drags him into the closet, hoping his body won't be discovered until she can make her escape. She hasn't returned to her apartment all night, which makes it likely that she has either fled the city or is hiding somewhere nearby. Then I can't, as you suggested, be concealing her in the house. Lieutenant Williams took on the role of instructor, with Mrs. Franklin as his attentive student. Not if that's your theory, but if she did escape the house at that time, what then? You found that scrap of paper where she wrote a vague threat to distract suspicion, a note likely born out of her frantic state of mind. You called the police, and we discovered Mr. Franklin. Your instincts pointed directly to the person who occupied your thoughts, Mr. Hollander. You reasoned he did this to protect you. Thus, when you learned that Mr. Franklin had been revived and was going to make a statement, you shot him to stop him from implicating Mr. Hollander, and you cleverly constructed your alibi, merely pretending to have taken the narcotic. That does sound like quite a case, doesn't it? Yes, Mrs. Franklin, it certainly does. And what's the alternative? You mentioned there was another possibility. That Nancy Norwich never left the house at all, that she is still here. This is what the prosecuting attorney will present to the jury, that with your knowledge, she accessed the balcony through one of the windows in your room and shot Mr. Franklin. You returned to your room, concealing yourself somewhere in this house. All of that, unfortunately, is negated, Lieutenant, by the fact that it was my slipper you found outside the window, not hers. The prosecuting attorney can twist the scene to fit that, Mrs. Franklin. Once Nancy Norwich stepped onto the balcony, you were struck with terror at what you were involved in. You tried to call her back, and when the shots rang out, you panicked. You dropped your slipper and hurried back into the room. Lieutenant Williams softened his tone. Which of my 2 theories should I trust? I can't make any promises, Mrs. Franklin, because any confession given with the expectation of leniency loses its weight in court. However, I can suggest that if you choose to cooperate with justice, it may turn out to be beneficial for you. There are more unwritten laws than just the ones everyone knows. Mrs. Franklin gave him a strange look. You don't intimidate me, she replied. Any choice I make will lead to a predictable outcome. The way I achieve it doesn't matter to me, as long as the end result remains unchanged. Lieutenant Williams assessed her. She seemed to be on a path of her own choosing, chasing a reckless obsession that led to destruction. Her apparent strength made any further attempts on his part seem pointless. To him, the attic held no more mystery or beauty. It was merely a chaotic room occupied by a striking woman who, like a petulant child reaching for the stars, sought ever deeper mysteries in that existence which seems to await beyond life, and by a weary, older man standing foolishly in his socks, away from his shoes. "Come downstairs with me, Mrs. Franklin," he said. "As soon as my men finish searching this house, you will be formally charged." Chapter 30. 11:11 a.m. The criminal and weapon of the crime. Lieutenant Williams found himself once again in his shoes. Even without laces, they instilled a sense of confidence about the order of things. Mrs. Franklin led the way down 2 flights of stairs to her husband's room, which Lieutenant Williams opened. Inside, he saw Christian deep in sleep, seated on the large mahogany chest by the window. He didn't so much blame Christian for his slumber as envy him. "Christian!" Christian snapped awake, with a quickness that would impress any hero from a Western film. "Sir!" "Put your gun away, Christian." Yes, Lieutenant. I must have dozed off for a moment. We can talk about that later. I need you to escort Mrs. Franklin down to the entrance hall and leave her in O'Brien's charge. She's under arrest. Yes, sir. After that, alert the men at the servants' entrance and garden door to stay vigilant. If anyone tries to get past them for any reason, they are to stop him. Find Hanson. He might still be in the backyard, and both of you return here. We'll search the house. Yes, sir. Lieutenant Williams entered Franklin's room and closed the door behind him. It had become a routine motion for him to approach the desk and take a seat. His gaze fell upon a perfumed sheet of notepaper that he had twice attempted to read before being interrupted. He read the letter in full. I don't believe you, and right from the start I'm telling you I think you're a liar and a louse. Harry never wrote your wife any such thing, and even if he did, it proves nothing. No one can prove a thing. You think it's amusing to scare me, and if you keep it up, I'll show you just how funny it can be. I'm done with you, just like your wife is done with you, and you're nothing but a nasty rat. Nancy. Not really, Lieutenant Williams thought. She was essentially a decent person. He folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket, where it would sit alongside the forged postscript created by Mrs. Franklin. This would effectively help establish a motive and give the prosecuting attorney a strong argument for the case. That is, as soon as he uncovered the criminal and the weapon used in the crime. That criminal, he reminded himself quietly, was still somewhere in the house with her weapon, unless his understanding of the situation was fundamentally flawed. And therein lay the risk, the source of that unsettling feeling of looming danger that had gripped him at odd moments throughout the night. It was strange that it seemed most intense in this quiet room. But wasn't that simply a matter of association? Franklin lay dead on the bed over there, and the path of that fatal bullet had sliced through that corner by the other window. He tried to shake off the sensation with a mental distraction. It wasn't wise to dwell on feelings of foreboding. There were a few minor details to consider, issues that puzzled him but did not directly relate to the main point. He believed they could be explained without further personal inquiry. For instance, it seemed clear to him why Mrs. Quammen had gone downstairs with her bonnet on. The sight of O'Brien at the front door had made her turn around. She wanted to contact Maisie's sailor, husband, to warn him that the crime she suspected he had committed had come to light, and that the police were in the house. She had told Mrs. Franklin that she thought she had seen him lingering in the street earlier that afternoon. And Mrs. Quammen would never doubt her own ability to step outside and find him because, if that was her wish, fate would arrange a convenient meeting. They came from that corner, those unmistakable waves of warning, as persistent as the scent that had led him to discover the letter from Nancy Norwich in the desk. But they weren't a scent, nor anything as concrete as a letter. They were the shocking thought sent a chill through him, Nancy Norwich, her essence, herself, unwelcome. Nonsense, nonsense. The room was empty. He forced himself to think of the two puzzling moments that had bothered him regarding the thoroughly perplexing Smithers. That loaded look she had given him, what did it truly mean? If not a strong desire on her part to wipe away any enchantment Mrs. Franklin might have cast over him, and to replace it with seeds of suspicion of Smithers's own planting. It had been nothing more than that. Even stranger was Smithers's suggestion that Hollander was the right friend to stay with Franklin, for Smithers had definitely harbored a bizarre passion for Franklin, bizarre because of the unusual connection between her personality and that of his brother who had died in the war, and she had undoubtedly believed that a romance was happening between Hollander and Franklin's wife. The only explanation was that Smithers had never seen Hollander and Mrs. Franklin together, and she had hoped that if morning brought them to meet, the dramatic setting would reveal some telltale sign. A glance, perhaps, was all she needed to validate her suspicions, and surely she couldn't have thought there was real danger to Franklin from Hollander, with a nurse and 2 policemen standing guard close by. Then later, when Franklin was well again, Smithers could have told him what she had observed. Mental fingers, that's what they were, plucking at his nerves and creating dissonances that struck him as oddly chilling. He wasn't alone. Yet he must be. The room was empty. He would think of that Mr. Smith, who lived with Hollander. Did he fit into the picture, beyond one hard blow to the head? It was just one of the many side issues that clung like parasites to the trunk of each major crime. One could reasonably assume, and later facts would prove this true, that Hollander was involved in some genteelly illicit business, perhaps bootlegging, while Mr. Smith helped him find customers in the nightclubs, discreetly relieving some of the more foolish patrons of their valuables. At that moment, as Lieutenant Williams headed to the telephone in their apartment, Mr. Smith might well have feared that if Hollander was caught, he could be in trouble too, making a blackjack seem like the easiest solution to ensure he vanished from the scene. The room was empty. The room was empty. As for the tangled emotional mess forged by Franklin, his wife, Nancy Norwich, and Hollander as they stumbled through their delusions to this tragic end that lay beyond the reach of earthly justice, the true judgment must be found within their own souls. Lies, evasions, dark, murky depths. But had she lied? Was there really no one on the balcony, as Mrs. Franklin insisted? The shot had clearly come from the direction of that window above the large mahogany chest. Above, any premonition faded in the face of reality. The lid of that chest wasn't quite closed, and what was keeping it ajar, just half an inch, was the small black barrel of a gun. Lieutenant Williams's hand moved lazily toward the upper left pocket of his vest, where a sleek, efficient little automatic rested. He understood what was happening. His stillness for the last 5 minutes had led the murderer to believe the room was empty and that they could slip away. His hand moved faster now, but not fast enough. The lid of the chest swung open wider eyes, faces, a fleeting expression of alarm and terror. All happened much more swiftly than words could convey. The lid flew open. Enough of that, Lieutenant. Place your hands flat on that desk. You must be Nancy Norwich, he said. He laid his hands on the polished mahogany surface and studied her captivating beauty as she perched on the edge of the open chest. She was flamboyant, exceedingly striking, with a wild cascade of bleached blonde hair framing her dark, enigmatic eyes. "You're in my way, Lieutenant," her voice grated like mismatched china, "and I'm going to kill you and escape." "I understand," Lieutenant Williams replied with a calm politeness, "that you believe in threes." "How so?" "Your husband, Mrs. Franklin's husband, and now me. 1, 2, 3. It's a shame I'm a bachelor for the sake of symmetry." For a brief moment, she relished the silence, truly savoring the sense of control she held over him. She had always reveled in the power of her femininity, and now, experiencing this different kind of strength, which flowed from the pistol firmly gripped in her hand, she was in command of life and death. She would shoot him soon. Lieutenant Williams hoped that Hanson wouldn't make a mistake. He could see Hanson clearly now, barely pressed against the outside of the window just behind Nancy. So Hanson had discovered how to reach the balcony from the garden below. It was often useful to have been a sailor, he mused. Lieutenant Williams fervently wished that Hanson would, having served his purpose, abandon his nautical ways and embrace his role as a policeman. He didn't expect Hanson to shoot a woman in cold blood, nor would Hanson likely startle her by flinging open the window or crashing through the glass. Could Hanson shoot through the window and disarm her? Perhaps one time in 20, Lieutenant Williams thought bleakly. She definitely wouldn't hold back from pulling the trigger while Hanson practiced for the 20th time. "Tell me," he said, "how on earth did you manage to breathe inside that chest?" "The back is broken." The casualness of his question caught her off guard, prompting an answer. "Must mean your own back is pretty much broken too." Was Hanson really about to smash the glass with the butt of his gun? He was staring intently at her, looking for guidance. She barely noticed him shaking his head slightly in refusal. "And what did you have in that paper bag you carried when you came here, the one from which you tore the scrap of paper to write that misleading note?" "This gun." "You carried the gun in a paper bag." Clearly, I was clever, wasn't I? Who would suspect a gun hiding in a flimsy paper bag? Not even someone from the fourth dimension. Hanson was now aiming at her wrist. It was ridiculous. He shook his head again, ever so slightly. "No, no. How is it that Mr. Franklin was wearing his overcoat while you ended up with his hat?" "I wore it as a disguise. The dust on my face, combined with the hat, gives me a wonderful cover. It really does the trick." "I see. So when Franklin came back into the room looking for it, he couldn't find it and thought he must have left it in the cupboard." "Yes, yes, you're pretty clever yourself. And you entered the house with a duplicate key you had made from one of Franklin." "Good grief, yes. How else would I have gotten in?" It didn't sit well with her that her moment of triumph should arrive amid such trivial exchanges, with inconsequential questions and equally unimportant answers being traded back and forth. This wasn't a show of bravado. The man was genuinely unafraid. She wanted him to feel fear. One shouldn't merely slip away from the world. There should be an explosion, a grand scene. Then Hanson tapped softly on the panes. Inspiration, brilliance, perhaps. Lieutenant Williams felt the pulse of his French heritage as he yearned to kiss that cherished, radiant Hanson on both his warm, clever Nordic cheeks. She spun around as if startled by a sudden touch. Clad in blue serge with brass buttons and a shining badge, she aimed the gun, yet the barrel rested against her lips.